A day of infamy, the Cuban invasion. This was a day that would forever change the course of history, a day that would be remembered for its unprecedented audacity and the sheer scale of its impact. November 7th, 1953 dawned like any other autumn day. The air was crisp, the leaves were turning shades of gold and red, and the world seemed at peace. The sun glinted off the waves crashing against the American coast, casting a serene glow that belied the storm that was about to break. Families woke up unaware of the horror that awaited them. Children prepared for school, parents readied themselves for work, and life went on as usual. At 6:45 a.m., the silence was shattered. A sudden loud noise reverberated through the air, causing people to look up in confusion and fear. A deafening roar echoed across the sky. The sound was unlike anything the American people had ever heard before, a harbinger of the chaos to come. Hundreds of Cuban planes bearing the red and white of their flag filled the horizon. The sight was both awe-inspiring and terrifying, a testament to the meticulous planning and execution of the invasion. The Cuban invasion had begun. It was a moment that would be seared into the collective memory of the nation, a moment that marked the beginning of a new and terrifying chapter in American history. It was a well-coordinated and brutal assault. The Cuban forces moved with precision and purpose, their strategy honed through years of preparation and training. Landing craft swarmed the beaches from Florida to Maine. The sheer number of troops and vehicles was overwhelming, a tidal wave of military might that seemed unstoppable. Cuban troops, armed with Soviet weaponry, poured onto American soil. Their weapons were state-of-the-art, their training rigorous, and their resolve unshakable. Coastal cities were caught completely off guard. The suddenness of the attack left little time for preparation or defense, and the results were devastating. Families eating breakfast were met with gunfire. The tranquility of their morning routines was shattered, replaced by fear and confusion. Children playing in parks witnessed unspeakable horrors. The innocence of their play was replaced by the harsh realities of war, a sight that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The day quickly descended into chaos. American defenses were overrun, their efforts to repel the invaders proving futile against the sheer force and determination of the Cuban assault. Military bases were bombed into submission. The strategic targets were hit with pinpoint accuracy, crippling the American military's ability to respond effectively. Civilians fled inland, desperate to escape the carnage. The roads were filled with families seeking safety, their faces etched with fear and uncertainty. By nightfall, the Cuban flag flew over much of the eastern seaboard. The sight of the foreign flag in American cities was a stark reminder of the day's events and the new reality that had been thrust upon the nation. America, the land of the free and the home of the brave, was under siege. The symbols of American strength and resilience were now scenes of conflict and turmoil. The sheer scale of the invasion was staggering. The number of troops, the coordination of the attack, and the speed with which it was executed left the world in shock. Cuba, a small island nation, had launched a surprise attack on the world's superpower. How was this possible? The question echoed in the minds of people around the globe. The answer lay in years of meticulous planning aided by America's Cold War enemies. The alliances and strategies that had been formed in secret were now playing out on the world stage. The Cuban dictator, Fulgencio Batista, had struck a deal with the Soviet Union. This alliance provided the resources and support needed to mount such a bold offensive. In exchange for becoming a Soviet satellite state, Cuba received the funding, weapons, and training needed to launch their audacious attack. The Soviet Union saw this as an opportunity to weaken their greatest adversary. The day would forever be etched in the annals of American history as a day of infamy. It was a day that tested the nation's resolve and unity, a day that would be remembered for generations to come. It marked the beginning of a long and brutal conflict, a war that would test the very soul of a nation. The American people would be called upon to show their strength and resilience in the face of unprecedented adversity. It was a war that would come to be known as the American Holocaust. The devastation and loss were immense, and the scars left by the conflict would take generations to heal. The nation would emerge from the war forever changed, its people united by the shared experience of hardship and sacrifice. Red Tide, the fall of America's coasts. This is a story of a nation caught off guard, a tale of unexpected invasion and the subsequent struggle for survival. The once peaceful shores of America were suddenly transformed into battlegrounds as warships loomed ominously on the horizon, signaling the beginning of a relentless assault. The initial shock of the invasion soon gave way to a grim reality. Civilians, who had never known the horrors of war, found themselves thrust into the chaos of conflict. The streets, once bustling with everyday life, were now filled with the sounds of marching soldiers and the cries of the displaced. Cuban forces, vastly outnumbering American defenders, swept across the country. Their numbers were overwhelming and their strategy was precise. The American military, unprepared for such a large-scale invasion, struggled to mount an effective defense. Their advance was relentless, fueled by a potent mix of Soviet weaponry and ideological fervor. The Cubans were not just fighting a war of conquest. They were driven by a belief in their cause, a belief that they were liberating America from the clutches of capitalism and imperialism. City after city fell under their control. The once proud American cities, symbols of freedom and democracy, were now under the iron grip of the invaders. The sight of foreign soldiers patrolling the streets became a common and disheartening sight. The first weeks of the war were a blur of defeats and retreats for the Americans. The military, caught off guard and outnumbered, was forced to fall back, abandoning cities and towns to the advancing enemy. The morale of the American troops was at an all-time low. The Cuban war machine, honed by years of preparation, seemed unstoppable. Their troops were well-equipped, well-trained, and highly motivated. The years of preparation and indoctrination had created a formidable fighting force, one that seemed capable of overcoming any obstacle in its path. Their troops, indoctrinated with communist propaganda, fought with a fanatical zeal. They believed in their mission, believed that they were the vanguard of a new world order. This belief gave them a fierce determination, a willingness to fight to the last man. They believed they were liberating America from the clutches of capitalism. To them, this was not just a war of conquest, but a war of liberation. They saw themselves as heroes, freeing the American people from the tyranny of their own government. The fall of New York City on December 14, 1953, sent shockwaves across the globe. The city, a symbol of American power and influence, was now in ruins. The world watched in disbelief as the iconic skyline was reduced to rubble. The iconic skyline, once a symbol of American might, was now draped in Cuban flags. The sight of the Cuban flag flying over American landmarks was a stark reminder of the new reality. The invaders were here to stay, and they were determined to reshape America in their image. The Statue of Liberty, a beacon of freedom, stood as a mute witness to the unfolding tragedy. The symbol of hope and liberty was now surrounded by the chaos of war. The irony was not lost on the American people, who saw their cherished ideals being trampled underfoot. The Cuban strategy was two-pronged. On one hand, they engaged in conventional warfare, using their superior numbers and firepower to overwhelm the American military. On the other hand, they employed more insidious tactics aimed at undermining the American resistance from within. While their military forces engaged in conventional warfare, a sinister plan was being implemented behind the lines. Cuban agents, trained in the arts of espionage and sabotage, were infiltrating American communities. Disguised as refugees, they blended in with the civilian population, waiting for the right moment to strike. Cuban agents, disguised as refugees, infiltrated American communities. They moved among the people, gathering intelligence, spreading propaganda, and sowing discord. Their presence was a constant threat, a reminder that the enemy was not just at the gates, but within the walls. Their mission to sow discord, spread fear, and undermine any resistance. They used every tool at their disposal, from spreading false rumors to committing acts of sabotage. Their goal was to weaken the American resolve, to make the people lose faith in their government and their military. The propaganda machine went into overdrive. The Cubans understood the power of information, and they used it to their advantage. They took control of radio stations, newspapers, and other media outlets, using them to spread their message. Radio broadcasts, controlled by the Cubans, blared out messages of American aggression and Cuban heroism. They painted a picture of the Americans as the aggressors, the villains of the story. The Cubans, on the other hand, were portrayed as the heroes, the liberators. False stories of American atrocities were circulated, designed to demoralize the population and create divisions. The Cubans knew that a divided people would be easier to control, and they used every means at their disposal to create those divisions. By the spring of 1954, the situation seemed hopeless. The American military was in disarray, the government was struggling to maintain control, and the people were living in fear. The Cuban grip on the country was tightening, and there seemed to be no end in sight. The Cuban grip on America tightened with each passing day. Military checkpoints were set up in every city, and the presence of Cuban soldiers was a constant reminder of the occupation. The American people were living under a state of constant surveillance and control. Millions of Americans were now living under occupation. Their lives had been turned upside down, their freedoms taken away. The streets were filled with the sounds of military patrols, and the sight of armed soldiers was a daily reality. The stage was set for one of the darkest chapters in human history. The American Holocaust had begun. The world watched in horror as the once mighty nation was brought to its knees, its people subjected to unimaginable suffering and devastation. The American Holocaust had begun. The stories of suffering and devastation were countless, each one a testament to the horrors of war. Families were torn apart, communities were destroyed, and the very fabric of American society was being unraveled. The fall of America's coasts was not just a military defeat, but a human tragedy of epic proportions.